everybody, and welcome again to another episode of the Risk Matrix with James Junkin.
Roll Tide. Although we've been rolled, I'm going to continue to support my team. So all of you worried about my mental health, it's okay. It's okay. We're good.
It's okay.
We're
So
good.
James Junkin and myself, Dr. Martin, here with the Risk Matrix, and today we have Chuck Simpson on. Thanks everybody for joining us. Before we get started, we have an episode sponsor. We all know that the Risk Matrix is powered by Veriforce, but today we're sponsored by the newest instructor-led course, Lockout Tagout Authorized and Affected Persons Training. The failure to properly isolate energy has led to thousands of injuries and fatalities each year. Lockout tagout violations are number 6 in the most frequently cited standards for OSHA. Enter Veriforce's newest program, Lockout Tagout for Authorized and Affected Persons. Using an instructor-led approach, the course is focused on reducing SIFs among workers. The curriculum is comprehensive and offers both theoretical knowledge and practical application as required by OSHA. To learn more about Veriforce's newest course, email trainingsales@veriforce.com. And again, welcome to the Risk Matrix, Chuck Simpson. I know that you reached out to James Junkin. You had a conversation. You got a story to tell, man.
Yeah, I do.
Well, let me kind of set this up for our listeners. The previous episode, if you've not listened to the previous episode, before you listen to this episode, go back and listen to the previous episode where we talked about the H2S incident at the Pemex refinery over in Deer Park, Texas, where we kind of talked about process safety. We talked about contractor management, subcontractor management, the importance of having a well-executed safety management system, and et cetera. Fast forward now to this, we're going to talk to one of the nation's leading experts on hydrogen sulfide. And I know, Chuck, you served on the ANSI committee that wrote some of the standards in the past, the ANSI Z390.1 committee. I'm on the ANSI Z390.1 committee. We just issued a new standard this year with some updates to that. But I found your story very compelling because it takes it from the realm of theoretical and academic to the actual impacts to line workers when we fail to isolate hazardous chemicals like hydrogen sulfide. So Chuck, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, who you work for, et cetera. Let our listeners get to know you.
Well, I'm Chuck Simpson. I'm a CSP. I've been in the safety business since the early 80s, and I have worked all over the United States. I've worked all over the world. I've spent a lot of time working on H2S locations and involved in various H2S safety groups. And my claim to fame is that I, back about 1983, survived exposure to 30% hydrogen sulfide. And a lot of times when I tell people that, they basically tell me that that's not possible, that that's a fatal dose, that there's just no way you were exposed to that. And I think there were some things that kind of worked in my favor, but I assure you that the measurements after the accident showed 30% H2S, and 0.1% is generally considered to be fatal. So I am kind of unusual in that I did survive a very extreme exposure. So with that, I guess you'd like me to go ahead and launch off into my story.
Absolutely.
Well, there's a couple things that I think you should take away from this story. Number one is what not to do on several levels. But one of the things not to do is to attempt a rescue unless you're properly trained and properly equipped. Now, fortunately for me, I was rescued by people who were not properly trained or properly equipped. And because there was a very high concentration, but a relatively low volume, they managed to escape without passing out themselves, although they were in the process of passing out as they rescued me. So I don't want anybody to come away believing that the rescue portion of my presentation is representative of what I think you should be doing. The other thing is that, I'm going to review some of the properties and characteristics of H2S and kind of remind you about some of those things. But what I'd also like to remind you is the importance of stop work authority. back in the early 90s, I don't think the term stop work authority had been invented. Early 80s, it had not been invented. So it really wasn't a concept on the forefront of people's minds. But there was a number of places in this misadventure I had on this job site where things were obviously going wrong, that if somebody had said, wait, what's going on here? I don't understand it. Let's issue stop work authority and kind of regroup and figure out what's happening here. I might have avoided the accident altogether. But there again, it wasn't a concept that was widely understood at the time. So what happened to me is I got hired by the Western Company of North America, which I'll mention because they're no longer in business and haven't been for 2 decades or more. And I was hired into the Crowley, Louisiana office. And I showed up in the training room and I got to spend the day reading about the design of stairways and ladders and rungs on ladders and all kinds of stuff that really had virtually nothing to do with my job on a daily basis. And the parts that had to do with my job were pretty weak. And one of those parts was about hydrogen sulfide safety. And it said, one paragraph, hydrogen sulfide hydrogen sulfide smells like rotten eggs and it can kill you and it's found in some oil wells. Well, that's all it said. So I didn't know anything about the oil field except what I'd learned on the Beverly Hillbillies, but that was enough to be alarmed by this little paragraph. So I go to my to the head training guy and I said, what's this all about? I didn't know anything about this. If there's high concentrations of a poisonous gas in the oil field, I don't want any part of it. And he said, oh, don't worry about that. We don't have any H2S in South Louisiana, which is not completely accurate, but they have less H2S in South Louisiana probably than any place in the world. So I felt a lot better. I go out and work for probably a year in the field, never heard the word H2S again, never thought about it again. And then I got called to go to a job in Waynesboro, Mississippi. And I rendezvous with the Mississippi crew and I asked them about the job site and what the difficulties were. And they said, oh, there's nothing special about this job. And I roll out there and I get on the job site and I start to rig up. We have our little pre-job meeting. Not one single word about H2S safety. Not one single piece of hydrogen sulfide safety.
But I bet slip, trips, and falls are on there, right?
Actually, yeah, I think
PPE.
PPE for sure. So anyway, what was amazing about that is this is a 30% H2S well where somebody had been hospitalized 6 months before, but not one word about it. What I found out later was this was a rather poor boy operation. Our company charged about 10% extra to work on H2S wells, and they just didn't want to pay it. And our salesman wasn't going to push the issue, so it got ignored in the interest of economics. Okay.
So, since you're talking in percentages of H2S, I'd like to just interject here real quick for our listeners. When Chuck says 30% H2S, that is 300,000 parts per million.
And it takes
parts per million.
And it takes 0.1% to kill you, or 1,000 parts per million. Okay, so this was extraordinarily high. This was really about as high as you typically see in the United States. So I start rigging up the tree saver on this acid job, and the well was killed with crude oil. And I noticed that when I would slide the tree saver into the wellhead, that the oil would kind of slosh down the wellhead, and that I would see visible vapors coming off. And that when I would put my head in this visible vapor cloud, I would immediately get a headache, and I would there was a very sweet odor. Okay, no rotten egg odor, so I didn't have any clue it was H2S. So I did pull my head out of that cloud, and the headache immediately went away. So I thought that was pretty unusual. And actually, this is one of those points where I should have thrown the stop work authority flag. There's something odd going on here that I don't understand. It's causing me some degree of physical harm. We need to regroup and figure this out.
So
But
that kind of goes back to, didn't mean to interrupt you there, Chuck. We had a previous guest, a guy that works for me. It said something I'd never heard of before. He said on the job, good things happen, bad things happen, and weird things happen. And when weird things happen, you need to stop.
Well, I've never heard it put like that, but I'm going to steal that from you. So anyway, yeah, there was a weird thing going on here. So I went over to my boss and I said, boss man, I put my head in this vapor cloud and there's this weird sweet smell and I got a headache. I pulled my head out of the cloud, it went away. What's the deal with that? Well, my friend, my supervisor, had been in the field for 30 years. And anything that he told me was gospel as far as I was concerned. And he told me that I should just shut up and go back to work because I was an ignorant college boy and I didn't know what I was doing. And you know what? There was a lot of that was true, but this is again one of those things where if the boss doesn't understand it, that's clearly under indication that something weird is going on. And the other thing you should take away from that is putting unconditional faith in a supervisor or a safety guy is not always a good thing. If that doesn't make sense, call them on it. Okay. So anyway, I continued the rig up, finished the rig up, go back to my truck and start into the acid job. And I was pumping some KCl. I was actually displacing, I was holding pressure on the backside of a packer. They were pumping acid down the tubing. And so about 2 hours into the job, the packer slipped and we got communication and there was a release of crude oil saturated with H2S out of a relief valve and it was blowing a big black cloud into a reserve pit. And I called on my radio headset and asked what I should be doing. And my boss said, well, what I want you to do is to attempt to bleed off some of the pressure onto the inventory tank of your truck. Well, I didn't like the sound of that because number one, I didn't really understand how that was going to work, and it was never going to work. The other thing that was a problem is the inventory tank of that design, a cement truck, was about 20 barrels, and it had four massive incandescent car headlights that pointed down into the inventory tank. Well, that inventory tank was never ever supposed to handle anything that was flammable or combustible. Well, when I opened up this valve, there was a rush of crude oil saturated with H2S. And so I'm looking in there at first, worried about how fast this tank is filling up because I'm afraid it's going to overflow and cover the truck and get all over the ground. And I didn't want that to happen. But then when I was looking in the tank, I noticed that there was this cloud of vapors coming off. And now I realize big problem because this is not explosion proof. This is not intrinsically safe. And there's fixing to be an explosion. So I yell gas and I go to throw the decompression latches on the truck and I never made it. When I yelled gas, I had to take a breath. And when I took a breath, I passed out. When I passed out, they saw me go down. And now they understand that there's a problem. And the whole crew runs up to the top of the hill and looks down on me. And they didn't know what to do because they never had any training. They didn't have any special equipment. They didn't even know what it was because nobody said it was H2S. So two of these guys came running down to rescue me, and probably 20, 30 barrels of oil had overflowed onto the ground before they managed to get the whole job shut down. So they're tromping through nearly ankle deep oil saturated with H2S. They climb up on the truck. I'm covered in the oil. The whole side of the truck's covered in the oil. They're starting to get dizzy because the H2S is coming off the oil. And they grabbed me by the belt and threw me over the side of the truck, which was probably more than a 10-foot fall. And I caught the rung on the steel ladder going down the side of the truck. I caught every rung with the back of my head, and that's what hurt for weeks after this accident. But anyway, they dragged me off to the top of the hill. Just by sheer luck, we have a pickup truck at the top of the hill. There was no emergency plan. Nobody knew where the nearest hospital was. The fact that they had a truck up there was just sheer coincidence. So they throw me in the back of the truck and take off down the road. They're doing 30, 40 miles an hour down a gravel road, a lot of wind noise, a lot of gravel in the wheel wells. And so I'm starting to come around because they're doing mouth to mouth on me. And the first thing I was able to do was hear. And what I was hearing was all this roaring noise. And I thought, there's been a blowout. And then I thought, if I can ever move again, I've got to run. Well, now we're doing, 40 miles an hour down the road. And I finally get my first breath. And it's just like when you get the wind knocked out of you. I catch that breath and I can now move. And I start running for all I'm worth, laying flat on my back in the truck. Well, now I realize, hey, I'm not going anywhere. I stand up and I throw a leg over the side of the truck while it's going down the road. and they wrestled me back into the truck. And then we go down the road, and we're going from Philisac store to Philisac store to get directions to the hospital because nobody knew where the Waynesboro Hospital was at. And then they get me to the emergency room Saturday night in the Waynesboro emergency room. I did have quite an audience. So they take me into the emergency room, and they cut all my clothes off of me because I was saturated with crude oil. They put me in the shower, and they scrubbed me down because they didn't want me to absorb any more H2S through my skin. And they also didn't want to have the exposure of the oxygen to the oil. And then they put me up on the table there, and they put oxygen on me, and they put 2 IVs in me, and I'm laying there buck naked. And I was quite agitated. And something that's not uncommon with people whose brain has been deprived of oxygen for extended periods of time is they get very agitated and actually belligerent. And so I was quite angry about the situation, and I was really hurting because I felt like somebody had slammed my temples with a sledgehammer. It was not fun. And I was puking every breath I took. And one of the guys who rescued me stuck his head in the door and said, "Doctor, how's he doing?" And I said, "You dirty so-and-so from Columbia, Mississippi, I am going to kill you." And I hopped up off the table and chased him about 20 feet down the hallway in front of my audience there at the Waynesboro emergency room, buck naked, dragging all the equipment behind me. And as finally it all stacked up on the door, and I had a couple of sheriff deputies and EMTs come in there and grab me, throw me up on the table. Now, the reason I tell this part of the story is not that I'm particularly proud of it, but sometimes when people have been overcome by H2S and been out for an extended period of time, they can do some very irrational things. And not only that, but they can be belligerent. Not everybody's belligerent, but I was belligerent. Okay. So I'm not telling you to tie them up and hit them in the head with a hammer or anything in preparation for them fighting with you. But you just need to know, good old Joe who went down may not be good old Joe who comes back. Okay. And this may last a minute or two. So anyway, what happened is for the next 3 days, I was steadily puking. I had a headache that was unbelievable. And then it's kind of in the third day, it started to get better, but it really lasted almost a week. When it was all said and done, I don't think I have any long-term health impacts from it. For several months after the incident, I did have a pretty rarely reported symptom of H2S exposure. Some people will develop prolonged psychological disturbances. And I actually had a high level of paranoia that I had to deal with that I had never had in my whole life before. But it took a couple months for that to completely go away. So that is the gist of my story. I think number one is these guys who rescued me got away with doing something that was really incredibly stupid. And maybe even if they had known it was H2S, they wouldn't have done it. But they didn't actually know that. So make sure that you execute your rescues properly with proper training, proper equipment. Make sure that you're aware of all the signs and symptoms of H2S exposure. It's not just rotten eggs. It's also possibly a sweet odor. It's also possibly no odor at all. There is problems sometimes with eye irritation. Sometimes there's not. There are some obscure things that can happen, like you can get fairly high concentrations of H2S. If there's high concentrations, you can get them through your skin. And if you're already pretty saturated with H2S, you don't need any more of that than you've already gotten. And then again, I think maybe one of the more important lessons, to quote you, James, is when something weird happens on the job, execute stop work authority, shut it down. And and if you can't get a reasonable explanation from your immediate supervisor, I would say kick it up to the next level. And if you have to, kick it up another level and kick it up to the corporate safety guy if that's what it comes down to. But something that is unexpected, you've not encountered before, is not part of your pre-job plan, is not part of your JSA, that's a good indication that we need to shut this job down and reconsider what's going on and maybe improve the safety there. But that's in a nutshell my story there, James.
That's a great cautionary tale for workers, right? Workers with H2S stop the job, right? But that's also a culture thing, an organizational culture thing. And you mentioned early on that, you had somebody above you that said just no problem, just go to work, right? So change needs to happen two places. It needs to happen with the workers, right? That they need to heed stories like your own. But organizational management needs to also look at how they handle high hazards such as H2S exposure, right? Especially in places where you're going to have it, and then where you're going to have it in high concentrations. So, I mean, it's one thing to tell somebody to say stop work, but it has to be supported.
Yeah, one thing that I would like to mention is, I am an older gentleman. So in the early 80s, the whole safety culture in the oil field was a lot different than it is now. And not only that, but the regulatory culture was a lot different. There were very few safety regulations that pertain specifically to H2S at that time, and there now are quite a number. But the other thing is, I think that the operators and the service companies have realized that it's in everybody's best interest to run a safe operation, and I think there's a little less let's call it cowboy style operations going on than there used to be. So
Well,
Thank
this goes back
goodness.
to something we've said on this show countless times. It's one of my favorite lines I stole from Fred Manuel, which is hazards are best controlled in the planning and design of the work, right? So when we know we've got a hazardous chemical such as hydrogen sulfide, that should trigger a lot of thought processes, risk assessments, specific controls, related to what if this occurs. And it sounds like from your story, without making any judgments here, but that there wasn't really a plan for an instance where we had nonconformity, where all of a sudden, you described that you're getting crude oil back into this tank and oh well, I think you ought to take that and put it in the truck, and the truck is not intrinsically safe and can't hold enough barrels. It sounds like there wasn't a proper planning process for that instance.
yeah, that's absolutely true. In fact, I was trying to remember what the chief topic of our pre-job meeting was, and the chief topic was safe spotting of the pumping equipment. There was a lot of concern about where to spot the pumping equipment, but I don't know that there was anything else really even discussed at that time.
And I hate to say this, in the contractor assessments I've been doing, and I kind of made a joke about slip, trips, and falls. Yes, that's a hazard, and yes, people slip, and yes, they get hurt. But I see that commonly on job hazard analysis, job safety analysis, and we get that one, but we miss probably the one that could kill us all, which is the 30% H2S. And that trend has continued. People treat these hazard assessments as almost as a mere formality, and we miss the opportunity to think about the hazard and think about the controls, etc. So in a time we got left, I kind of want to shift focus. You said things have improved, and I think things have improved since the days of the 80s. I was in the oil and gas industry, not in safety, in the mid 90s to the early 2000s, and certainly things have changed since that time. And one of the things that's changed, Chuck, is the ANSI committee, the ANSI Z390 committee that's developed the training standard for H2S. And I know you've served on that committee in the past, and I'd like you to comment, if you would, on the importance of standardized H2S training.
Oh, it's absolutely critical, so that basically everybody, that particular standard talks about what are the hazards that people should be made familiar with, what are the safe work practices, what equipment is typically provided. There's a lot of emphasis, needless to say, on the training associated with it, but that provides a framework to make sure that everybody is on the same page. Everybody has essentially the same information, and is aware of the same safe work practices and the same characteristics of H2S and things like that. So.
I've been honored to serve on that committee, have been an H2S master trainer like you for many years. And the one thing I think, if I could wave my magic wand and improve on, is people understanding the importance of standardization around that particular ANSI standard. You know, when I go in the field, I see people have H2S cards all the time. They have fit test cards all the time. They're fit tested on a 3M, you know, 3100, 3200, 33, you know, half mask air purifying respirator, which is not to be used with hydrogen sulfide. When you talk about their H2S training, they had the 30-minute course, they had the hour course, they had all this. And what the ANSI committee has been able to do is bring together a lot of the experts, yourself included, to come up with what workers need to know in the event of an H2S release that will fundamentally save their lives. And I don't know any training program that's 30 minutes that is going to offer me enough information for me to be able to respond in a manner that's appropriate in a H2S exposure. So hats off to the committee that you served on previous to ours, and creating and setting the framework for training programs that really impact workers and help prevent incidents like you went through. And if there is an incident, there are protective measures in place. So, you know,
Thank you both for the work on the H2S standard. I know, can you tell James or Chuck when the most recent version came out and some of the things that possibly for the future, the next revision will be looking at?
Well, one of the things I served on the subcommittee that rewrote the standard and was part of the writing team for that. You know, there wasn't a lot of changes because H2S hadn't changed, right? But one of the things we wanted to clarify is some of the techniques used for training, the incorporation of a 490 training style into your course, knowledge, skills, and abilities assessments, and how to focus on emerging technologies related to the detection of H2S. So things in that realm are always changing. The chemical doesn't change, but how we approach the controls change, how we teach workers changes, how we make sure that they have knowledge that goes beyond the classroom changes. Now, one of the things that's really important about the ANSI standard related to hydrogen sulfide is it is an instructor-led course. It is 3.5 to 4 hours in length. It works really well in combination with respiratory protection. Because like from Chuck's story, it had been probably, I mean, Chuck didn't get lucky in the sense he was overcome by this H2S, but Chuck shouldn't be here now. Chuck should be dead.
Thank you very much.
That went down there to rescue Chuck, they should be dead.
They should also be dead.
And
That's
we
right.
should have a multiple fatality situation right here. People got lucky. You know, God was watching that day after Chuck and his team. That's all I can say with the amount of H2S they're exposed with. So when you talk about H2S, if we're going to have rescue, then we've got to have supplied air. So people are protected. And again, this goes back to identifying hazards, putting in proper controls, because if you do that, then you don't have to, you know, in a situation that you don't rise to the occasion, you descend your level of training. So a lot of training that we have out there, like Chuck said, is some cases awareness level training. We're making you aware of the hazards. We really don't tell you how to deal with it. H2S training on an ANSI Z390.1 model, like Veriforce's H2S Clear is designed to empower the worker. And it matches up very well with other trainings that you may need, like lockout tagout, which is a sponsor for this course.
Right.
Confined space entry.
Confined space.
Absolutely. So, you know, I see in the assessments I do, and Chuck, you work for an insurance company, you probably see this as well. I'll ask you to comment on it. Companies getting the shortest amount of program and training through e-learning modules, and as long as it has the name of the course at the top, well, we're good.
Yeah, and you know, I see that it's like post-COVID more and more where people have bought into the idea that they can use these online training courses, some of which are really short, as facilitating regulatory requirements. But with H2S, in particular, over the years, I've been involved and participated in classes where I was just a student, which were as short as 30 minutes. I've been in some that were as long as 3 days. Okay. And I can tell you that with this course, and I don't know what the current standard says, I would be hard pressed to believe you could do an adequate job in under 4 hours. And in fact, if you did a really good coverage of the SCBA portion, it might be considerably longer than that. And there is sort of a muscle memory component to this in terms of reacting to the alarms, putting on the SCBAs in an efficient and safe manner. And then the other thing that's important with the instructor being there is things go wrong in those classes. I've had multiple people actually have heart attacks in an H2S class. I've had multiple people injure themselves swinging the SCBAs a little too violently and actually hitting their neighbor. So there needs to be somebody there to kind of reinforce the muscle memory component of the training, and to also make sure that the students don't get hurt during the course of the training, because it's moderately hazardous.
Absolutely. I got one for you. When I first got in the oil field, we had to go to this H2S class. And this guy that taught the class, everything you did, you were going to die. And it was 4 hours. You get out of the truck, you thinking about mama, you're going to die. You better be thinking about H2S. You ain't thinking about H2S, you're going to die. Now, this is my first entry into the oil and gas industry. I was so stressed out after those 4 hours, I went home and told my wife, I said, I'm going back in the Navy. She said, why? I said, man, they killing people and stacking them like cordwood in the oil and gas industry. I felt like I needed a strong drink, a joint, or a Xanax after coming out of that H2S class. So, our goal is not to scare everybody, but you need to have a healthy fear and awareness of this chemical. And we work safely
Great.
around hydrogen sulfide at my company every day. Not wells as hot as 300,000 parts per million, but some in the 50,000 parts per million, where we're definitely in an area where an inhalation hazard could result into serious injury, if not a fatality, most likely fatality. But we follow a process. We follow our training. We remind people of training. We refresh this training annually in conjunction with the ANSI Z390.1 standard. So I want to say this as we wrap it up. There's not an H2S vertical standard notion. OSHA's got one for lead. They got one for hexchrome. They got one for asbestos. They do not have one for H2S, right? So they may not cite you against the ANSI Z390.1 standard. But if you're a company and you're a risk manager and you're listening to this, understand that there will be legal actions outside of OSHA. Wrongful death actions, gross negligence actions. And a lot of times people will use the ANSI Z390.1 standard and say, why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do that? Why was your training only 30 minutes long? Why didn't you go with a training program that was recommended by some of the top experts in H2S on this planet? And if your response is, well, it was cheaper, we didn't have time, we think our program is pretty good. Obviously not, because you got people in the hospital and maybe people in the cemetery. So I really encourage people to embrace Chuck's story, which is very powerful story. And you tell it so well, Chuck, about the hazards of dealing with H2S, properly identifying those hazards in the design phase of the work, putting right controls in, but then in conjunction with that, having an effective training program that empowers workers and doesn't just check a box.
So thank you, Chuck, for coming on. We really appreciate you enlightening us with your story. We're glad you're here with us and have that story to tell to have others learn and hopefully do better. So James.
Before we go out, Chuck, if people want to get in contact with you, to tell this story to maybe a safety meeting or a corporate event or something of that nature, how would they get in touch with you, Chuck?
Well, you can email me at chuck.simpson@epicbrokers.com, or you can just send me a text message at 504-577-4743.
All right. Thank you, Chuck, again. And James, if people want to learn more about what we do, talking about risk in different industries and in different forms, how do they do that?
Hey man, head on over to Veriforce's YouTube channel. Check out the Risk Matrix podcast. A new one drops every Tuesday. You need to go over there and like it. You need to subscribe. That way you can be notified when new episodes are released every Tuesday around noontime Central. So also we're on Spotify. If you got Spotify, I got Spotify. It's great, man. Episodes of the Risk Matrix pop up on there, as well as our inventory of previous episodes. We're getting really close to our 70th episode of the Risk Matrix.
Right.
So go back, check out some amazing guests that we've had, some of our very interesting podcasts. We hope you like it, and we'll hope you join us for this and following episodes as we round out 2025.
So thanks for listening, and for everybody out there, keep bringing those workers home safe from high hazard jobs, and roll tide.
Roll Tide out.